Hi everyone. My name is Benjamin. Today I'll be talking about my Google Summer of Code project for 2022, streamlining the OrcaAL, or rather what we call it's the Orca active learning tool. So maybe just to give a little background about myself, I'm a third year computer engineering student from Singapore. I'm currently at UC Berkeley on a university exchange for a year. So I started my journey predominantly in data science and machine learning, and I've kind of slowly been transitioning towards software engineering, and that kind of led me to Google Summer of Code 2022. So I've just found it really inspiring to see this international community of researchers and developers working to collaborate and save the orcas. So it's something that I'm really passionate about. So just to give us a brief background behind OrcaAL, this was actually a Google Summer of Code project in 2020 by two students, Diego and Kunal. So basically the idea is that they wanted to develop an active learning tool that would be able to classify whether a sound had been made by an orca or not. Yep. So the two pictures that you can see here are what the tool look like if you do access it. On the left is what you would the interface that you see when you go to the website, and then basically if you click listen, it would bring you to a place where you could actually label some sounds that are provided by the tool. So basically the idea behind active learning is that it's based on the premise that data labeling is very expensive. And so instead of having to collect and label every single example, we basically train a model on a minimal set of examples in hopes of it being able to iteratively improve over time through human or what we call the OrcaAL labeling. So in that sense, that would improve the model much faster. So that was kind of what was done in 2020. So for my project, it was basically about trying to improve the tool further, more on the infrastructure side of things. So the first problem that we had was that it was pretty difficult to onboard new developers. And one of the reasons for that was that there were tests that were made by the two students, but these weren't enforced. And so if there were any code commits or new features created, it was quite difficult to ascertain whether or not they worked properly. Yep. Sorry. Yeah. The second issue was that there were many components of the tool. So if you look at the diagram on the bottom, basically the tool had a front end, a back end. Basically, we stored our data in the S3. So our spectrograms, the raw audio files, model checkpoints. And then we also had a Postgres database to sort of store the metadata. And this made it pretty difficult because there were actually quite a few languages, and it was pretty tedious to set up the tool and get it running even on a local environment. So and I guess additionally, the setup and the code were very much tied to AWS S3. So if we had new researchers, for example, and they had their own data sets on maybe Google Cloud Platform, or they just had a zip file, it was really difficult for them to sort of use it and build off what we had done with OrcaAL. So just to briefly go through some of the things I've been doing. For those of you who haven't used Docker before, it kind of just provides this environment. It's a technology called virtualization, where basically on the same machine, you can run different types of OS, and it should run very consistently. So the benefit of this is that you don't need to download or install all sorts of different dependencies and sort of avoid a lot of those dependency conflicts that we so often get, especially when we're using a language such as Python. So beyond just introducing that as well, basically optimizing how a lot of these Docker files work. So an example that I have here was trying to use something called multi-stage builds within the Docker files. And by doing that, basically I just need to maintain this single Docker file to run either a development environment, as shown by the green box, or the production environment. And so this makes it much easier to maintain. and it also reduces the memory constraints, the memory usage by quite a bit, from over 7 gigabytes to just slightly over 2 gigabytes. And so I mean, I think this is potentially important for downstream applications, especially if you're thinking about deploying to cloud and we have cost constraints, because we are able to sort of rent lower memory instances in future. Another thing that was also being done was continuous integration and development and deployment, with GitHub Actions. So basically, I mentioned earlier about the whole idea of testing and it being important. So GitHub Actions is sort of a free feature that comes with GitHub, where you can be able to test your code regularly and sort of ensure that you have this pipeline going from development all the way to the point where you sort of deploy. So an example of how it works is that you basically just write a YAML file, and that kind of defines a configuration of how this entire of how your whole pipeline will work. So yeah, the picture above, you can sort of see me running Docker Compose. So Docker Compose, I mean, I mentioned previously about Docker. It just kind of orchestrates how all the different containers start up to ensure that they do it in a synchronous manner, and then subsequently when they're shutting down as well. Yeah. So the pictures on the bottom show how it would look like when you run GitHub Actions. The one on the left is if the job runs successfully, and the one on the right is when it fails. So this provides a very quick way to be able to tell whether or not if a new developer comes on board and they start pushing code, yeah, whether or not the code is of acceptable quality and whether it breaks anything that's currently existing. So yeah, to kind of wrap up with future and further work, one of the things that I mentioned was that currently the testing is very much limited to unit and integration testing. But I think in machine learning especially, there are a lot of other tests that can be used, especially with monitoring how model performance changes or regresses over time. So yeah, I was reading this paper called Checklist, but it was based, I think this was based on a few in NLP, but basically they talked about writing sort of unit tests specifically for ML models and having behavioral and regression tests to measure some of these metrics. So another thing that could be improved is the front end. So previously I sort of showed how the front end sort of looks like. And right now it's pretty much limited to the use case of being able to label whether or not a given sound is made by an Orca or not, and which pod it is. So I think it's JK and L pods for now. So basically, if we're thinking of adapting this use to, I mean, humpback whales or other species of whales, right, or even other use cases, other localities of where orcas are. So yeah, these would sort of need to be considered as well. The last thing that I was thinking of is about trying to use OrcaAL's infrastructure. Yeah, it's something as like infrastructure as code. So basically, I mean, for example, when we deploy everything on AWS, it's you know, if somebody else wants to deploy it, they need to sort of rent their own VM instances and things like that, and that can get really tedious and repetitive. But there are open source tools currently available, such as Terraform, where you can sort of define what resources a certain tool or software would need, and then it would sort of basically just provision everything based on that. So yeah, by working with some of these open source tools available, I think it will make it a lot easier in future to produce and deploy new instances for other use cases as well. Yeah, so I've come to the end of my presentation. Does anyone have any questions?